You know that feeling when your phone rings and you just stare at it? You see the name, you know exactly who it is, and for some reason, your first thought isn't, I should answer. It's, I'll call them back later. Then later becomes an hour, then a day, then suddenly 3 days have passed, and now replying feels even more awkward because you waited too long. So you avoid it even more. The same thing happens with messages. You read the text, you think about replying, you even write the response in your head, and then nothing. You put your phone down. Not because you don't care. Sometimes you care so much that answering feels like work. And that's the part people around you don't understand. They think you're ignoring them. Maybe they think you're rude, cold, uninterested. But what if the real reason has almost nothing to do with how you feel about them? Psychology has an explanation for why you can genuinely care about someone and still avoid their calls and messages. Because sometimes your brain doesn't experience communication as connection, it experiences it as a demand. And once you understand that, your phone habits start making a lot more sense. Think about what happens when someone calls you unexpectedly. Before you've even answered, your brain has already started asking questions. What do they want? Is something wrong? How long is this conversation going to take? Do I have the energy for this right now? What if they ask me something I don't know how to answer? What if the conversation gets emotional? What if they need something from me? And suddenly, a simple phone call feels like an appointment you never agreed to. So, you let it ring. And when it stops, you feel relieved. That's the strange part. You can love someone deeply and still feel relief when their call ends. Not because you wanted them gone, because your nervous system finally gets its space back. And if you're someone who needs time alone to recharge, unexpected communication can feel especially intrusive. You were doing your own thing, watching something, working, thinking, listening to music, maybe just sitting there, doing absolutely nothing. Then your phone lights up. Now someone wants access to your attention, and even if the request is completely reasonable, part of you thinks, can I just have 5 minutes where nobody needs anything from me? That doesn't make you antisocial. It might mean you value control over your attention more than you realize. Because here's something your brain doesn't like: interruptions. Your mind gets comfortable in one mental state, and suddenly a notification pulls you into another. You weren't emotionally preparing to talk. You weren't mentally preparing to socialize. You were simply existing, and now you're expected to switch modes instantly. For you, that switch can feel surprisingly expensive, especially when you're already tired. That's why you might ignore a message you genuinely intend to answer. You don't necessarily think, I don't want to talk to this person. You think, I don't have the energy to talk right now. There's a huge difference. But here's where things get complicated. Sometimes you don't answer because you don't know what to say. Someone sends you a long emotional message. You read it, you care, you want to respond properly, so you think, I need to give them a thoughtful answer. And because you don't have the mental energy to give the perfect answer right now, you give no answer at all. Then you feel guilty. Then the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Now, you're not just avoiding the original message, you're avoiding the guilt attached to not responding. And suddenly, one unanswered text becomes 10 times heavier than it ever needed to be. You tell yourself, it's been too long now. They're probably annoyed. What am I even supposed to say? So you wait another day, and another, until replying feels like reopening a problem you created yourself. This is where avoidance can become a cycle. You feel overwhelmed, you avoid the communication. Avoiding it gives you temporary relief. That relief teaches your brain that avoidance works. So the next time you're overwhelmed, you avoid again. And the cycle gets stronger. Psychologists often talk about negative reinforcements in situations like this. It sounds complicated, but it's actually simple. Your brain repeats behaviors that make uncomfortable feelings disappear, even temporarily. You don't answer the phone, your anxiety drops. Your brain learns, good, that worked. You ignore the message, the pressure disappears for a while. Your brain learns the same thing. The problem is that the relief doesn't last. Eventually, the guilt comes back, then the anxiety comes back, and now you have two problems instead of one. The original conversation and the conversation you're having inside your own head about why you haven't had it. You've probably experienced this. You see a message sitting there. You think about replying, you don't. Then hours later, you open your phone again just to check if they sent anything else, you still don't respond, and somehow you're thinking about that message more than you would have if you'd simply answered. That's the irony of avoidance. You're avoiding a 5-minute discomfort and replacing it with hours of mental discomfort. But there's another reason you might avoid calls and messages. You don't like being emotionally available on demand. If you're naturally introspective, you probably need time to process your own thoughts before you share them with someone else. When someone asks, "How are you?" you may genuinely need a minute to figure out the answer, because you don't want to give the automatic answer. You don't want to say good when you're not good, but you also don't want to unpack your entire emotional life every time someone checks in. So you choose silence. And people interpret the silence as distance, when really you're trying to find the right words. This is especially common when you care deeply about how your words affect other people. You don't want to send something careless. You don't want to sound angry when you're just tired. You don't want to accidentally hurt someone. You don't want your message to be misunderstood. So you keep editing, and sometimes you edit yourself right out of the conversation. There's also something called social exhaustion. You don't have to hate people to get tired of interacting with them. You can genuinely enjoy your friends, love your family, care about your relationships, and still reach a point where you don't want to talk to anybody. You just want silence. No questions, no explaining, no reacting, no performing, no needing to be interesting. Just quiet. And honestly, that's something modern life doesn't make easy. You're reachable all the time. Your phone follows you everywhere. Someone can text you at breakfast, call you during work, send you a meme at midnight, ask why you haven't responded. There's this invisible expectation that if you're technically available, you should also be emotionally available. But those are completely different things. Your phone may be on. You may be awake. You may even be looking directly at the notification, and you can still not have the emotional capacity for a conversation. That's not the same thing as not caring. But there's another side to this that you should be honest about. Sometimes you avoid communication because you're afraid of what happens when you actually engage. Maybe you don't like confrontation. Maybe you worry about disappointing people. Maybe you fear being misunderstood. Maybe you're afraid that once you answer, they'll ask for more, and you'll have to set a boundary. You'll have to say no. You'll have to explain yourself. You'll have to deal with an emotion you've been trying not to feel. So instead of facing the conversation, you disappear. And this is where avoidance can stop protecting you and start controlling you. Because healthy solitude feels like a choice. Avoidance feels like fear making the decision for you. That's an important distinction. If you ignore your phone because you genuinely need rest, that's one thing. If you ignore everyone because you're terrified of conflict, rejection, expectations, or emotional closeness, that's something worth looking at. Not because something is wrong with you, because your brain may have learned that distance feels safer than interaction. And sometimes that lesson comes from experience. Maybe you've had people who demanded too much from you. Maybe your boundaries weren't respected. Maybe answering one simple message used to turn into hours of emotional labor. Maybe people constantly expected you to fix things. So your brain learned, if I don't answer, I don't have to deal with it. And honestly, that strategy makes sense. It protected you. The problem is that your brain doesn't always know when the danger's gone, so it keeps using the same strategy even with people who aren't trying to hurt you. And that's why you might sometimes avoid people you actually love. Not because you want distance, because your brain associates communication with obligation. That's something you can change. You don't have to become the person who answers every call immediately. You don't have to be available 24 hours a day. You don't owe everyone instant access to you. But you can start creating a healthier relationship with communication. Sometimes a simple message is enough. I'm low on energy right now. I'll get back to you tomorrow. That's it. No long explanation, no guilt, no disappearing. You're allowed to need space, and you're also allowed to communicate that you need space. That's the difference. Because the goal isn't to become more available, it's to become more intentional. Answer because you want to. Take space because you need to. Set boundaries when something feels overwhelming. And stop confusing silence with emotional strength. Because sometimes avoiding the conversation feels easier until you realize the conversation never actually went away. It just moved into your head. And maybe that's the deeper psychology here. You don't necessarily avoid calls and messages because you don't care about people. Sometimes you avoid them because you care about your energy. Sometimes because you're overwhelmed. Sometimes because you don't know what to say. Sometimes because you're afraid of what the conversation might require from you. And sometimes you simply need a little more quiet than the people around you understand. That doesn't make you cold, it doesn't make you rude, and it definitely doesn't mean you don't love the people in your life. But if your phone has become something you constantly hide from, maybe it's worth asking yourself why. Are you protecting your peace? Or are you protecting yourself from something you're afraid to face? Because those two things can look almost identical from the outside, but they feel completely different on the inside. If you enjoy understanding human behavior, subscribe. And honestly, when you ignore a call or leave a message unanswered, are you usually protecting your energy or avoiding the feeling that comes with having to respond?